True to my word, 24 hours later, I'm back. How's it going? This is Robert Phoenix. Welcome to another edition of 15 Minutes of Flame. It is the 11th of January. 1/11/18. How is everybody? Another gray day in Austin, Texas, as the sun competes for space in the sky with those funny little tendrils that are sprayed at an increasingly lower altitude for higher impact rate. Yes, the controversial chemtrail is with us and will be until likely around April, May, right around May. Then all of a sudden it begins to abate, and in other parts of the world, i.e. the southern hemisphere, the spraying starts up again. That's one of the things we get into on Emily and Randy's show, also known as Off Planet Radio. It should be up on Saturday for those of you who have been inquiring and interested about hearing the 3-hour show. Wow, it was 3 hours. It was worth it, though. It was good. It's good stuff. Every time we do a show, it just gets better. Better and better and better. And so for some of you who are burnt out on politics, you'll hear some of that. You'll hear some politics, and then you'll hear some other stuff, talking about consciousness and Terence McKenna and the reality of a spiritually infused world versus a materially dominated world, which is kind of where we are now in some ways. I saw an interesting movie last night. Of course, I always like to report back on my cinematic experiences. I don't go to the movies anymore. I'm not sure who does. The last movie I saw was Murder on the Orient Express, which was interesting. And even that I could break down and say, there's a little bit of a message here. I should actually do a review on, on that film. It's really well done. Kenneth Branagh directed it. I'm a big fan of period pieces, and the periods are moving closer and closer to us in the event horizon. So a film that takes place in, the 1930s is now a period piece versus Stanley Kubrick's period piece. The great Barry Lyndon. If you have 3.5 hours that you want to invest in a absolutely fascinating movie, I highly suggest watching Barry Lyndon. Lyndon Barry with Ryan O'Neal in a Stanley Kubrick movie. Stanley Kubrick knew who to cast. He was very good at it. Ryan O'Neal plays a brigand. And I believe old Stan knew that deep at heart, Ryan O'Neal was a brigand. And Irish to boot. Playing the Irish Lyndon Barry. And the thing about Barry Lyndon is the lighting is so incredible because Kubrick was going with natural lighting, which is almost unheard of. When you do that, you've got to open up the aperture and let a lot of light in. So there's not a lot of camera movement in some of these scenes. They're big, wide-angle shots where the characters move around, or they're generally stationary. It's a very fascinating movie. They don't move around a lot in some of the scenes, and he's using special kinds of powders and stuff on the candles and the lights to give them brighter luminescence. Fascinating. He was such an master to the attention to detail, Kubrick, and a very controversial figure at that. Left us with some very important films. Anyway, the movie I saw last night is called The Formula. And I'm a huge fan of 1970s cinema, not just because I came of age in the 70s, but because the 70s cinema is rife with conspiracies. If you want to see a really, really good movie that has a conspiracy tone from start to finish, check out The Parallax View with Warren Beatty. It's a really good movie. Really, really good. And there's more. There's a lot more. There's 3 Days of the Condor. I should do a top 10 of 70s conspiracy films. Well, this film was made in 1980, but it started, the pre-production and the script and all that was released in 1980. So, this is a 1970s film. It's called The Formula. And it's with George C. Scott, who I think is one of the most underrated actors of all time. And then George C. Scott's amazing. It's like when he's in a character, he's totally in a character. He just chews up the scenery. And this guy was a remarkable actor. And Marlon Brando is in the film. Brando, and it's okay, when you see George C. Scott, he's always George C. Scott. But you kind of like let it go because he's so into the character, and you don't get that he's acting, although he's clearly acting. Brando loses himself in the character. He becomes these other people, and he becomes, in this movie, he's an oil baron. He's an oil executive, and he works for a company called Reich Energy. Reich Energy. And it's a film that gets into Nazi Germany and the collaboration between the Americans and the Germans when it came to the German high tech. Now, the Germans supposedly had a synthetic fuel that they were using, and they had found a way to take coal and turn it into this synthetic fuel, and they called it the Genesis Project. And there is a formula for the Genesis Project that is at the center of this movie. It's interesting because Network is another one of those 70s conspiracy films too. And this is kind of along the lines of Network. It's like the network of the oil industry. And you kind of get a look behind the scenes as to the shady deals and business making and the oil companies buying up rights to all this alternative technology so they can dominate the marketplace for a very long time. It's a good movie. I recommend it. If you have, I'm sure it's out there somewhere. I watch it on TCM, and it's. But they can't resist getting this. It's like, okay, I'm watching a movie about the knowledge transfer from the Germans to the Americans and bringing the Germans over into American companies and employing them and all that stuff. It's like, okay, this is interesting. And why they're suppressing the technology. This is interesting. And dominating the marketplace, setting the oil prices. I mean, they get into this. There's a very interesting scene where Brando, who plays the head of this oil company, he's so oily. He's such an oily character in this film. You can tell he got into it because he just wanted to kind of rip the shit out of these people. This was his contribution. And this is during, basically what they say in the movie is that we are OPEC. We created OPEC, which is true. I mean, if you go back to the 1970s, for some of you who weren't around then, we had gas rationing. If your license plate ended on a odd number, you had to get your gas on an odd day. You couldn't get it on an even day. So today I could go get gas if I had an odd number on my license plate. So that was kind of the crazy part of the 1970s was this oil rationing. And of course, we had two phases. We had the second one when Carter was in office. We had to go through that again. We had to go through it twice because Carter pissed people off when he was president. And Iran, decided they were going to stop producing oil, or not produce it, but distribute it and ship it to the United States. But in the movie, Brando essentially said, his character says, yeah, we created OPEC. And of course, during the 70s, it was OPEC who were raising the prices and the demand for oil. And I think Saudi crude had gone over 400% of its barrel price. And then in the movie, Brando said, hey, we are OPEC. We created OPEC. Of course, the United States was a member of OPEC. Not a lot of people knew about that. What would have happened if we had the internet back in the 1970s? It would be a very different world. Anyway, it's worth checking out. But they couldn't. I'm into this movie. Like, okay, this is good. This is interesting. There's some shots happening in Berlin. Again, now it's a period piece because there was the wall in East Berlin, and that's all quite visible. And but they couldn't resist getting the Holocaust in there. They had to put the Holocaust in there somewhere. And it comes in a really weird spot of the movie. So George C. Scott and Martha Keller, who was a very beautiful German actress who had about 3 years worth of, or maybe about 4 or 5 years worth of popularity here in this country. And she generally played these Germanic roles. I think her most famous Germanic role was in a movie called Black Sunday with Bruce Dern. And she was a German terrorist. And she was hooked up with crazy Bruce Dern. And they were going to fly a dirigible into a football game as an act of terror. Another conspiracy film from the 1970s. Bit of a different conspiracy. So she had a bit of a run. She's quite beautiful. She was in the movie last night. Not a bad actress. She went back to Europe and has been starred in a lot of movies in Europe. Anyway, George C. Scott and Martha Keller have a bit of a fling inside the film. But they're at a strip club in Berlin, and they're watching these these women, and they're wearing like SS-style hats, and they're wearing these high knee-high boots, and they're doing pole dancing, and they're vaulting. You know, that's the Zig Heil, and they're goose stepping, and they're stripping, and in the background they've got this film playing with Adolf Hitler, and you know the big rallies, you know, Nuremberg, and you know all these, you know, it's like all this stuff, and then all of a sudden the imagery goes to concentration camps. It's like, so now we're getting concentration camps and strippers. It's a totally traumatic moment, right? I mean, this is like, you know, it was bizarre. It lasts for about, I don't know, 5 minutes. So you've got German striptease, fascist striptease, and Holocaust imagery, and Martha Keller gets triggered. She gets triggered. So anyway, so other than that, I mean, I thought it was a pretty interesting movie. So if you're into that genre, check it out. The world is one big giant conspiracy, and we know it. And it's fun, right? I mean, this is why we do board games. And this is why people who are into like sleuth movies and trying to figure out who done it, who did it. And the world is like that. It's one giant board game. Although for some people, it's a deadly giant board game. Because there are serious investments in the game. And if you threaten those investments, guess what happens? You get taken out of the game. It's very interesting. Now I'm wondering what's going to happen with our buddy Kim over in North Korea, because he's starting to look less and less like this evil, grinning, coldly calculating, sadistic, psychopathic leader who cares not one whit about his people, forces them into starvation, and uses all the resources to create great new shiny missiles that can go further and further and further and explode greater and greater payloads. But guess what he's doing? He's having conversations with this guy Moon from South Korea. I actually wrote about Moon last year. When he came into power, I looked at this guy's an Aquarius. Not only is he an Aquarius, but he actually has some interesting aspects to his chart which are pretty evolved. So this guy Moon, who's on the left, because they got rid of the other guy who was he was too hardcore, and he was also a bit on the corrupt side, his predecessor. So Moon comes in, and I would not say that he fits the headline profile of what the Trump administration, from the neocon perspective, is looking for in a global partner. And he's been extending himself to Kim for, I don't know, the last 5 or 6 months. And now, as the Olympics approach, there's a very good chance that the North Koreans are going to send some athletes. I have no idea what they're going to participate in or how they're going to do. At this point, it probably doesn't matter. Just as long as it's not like the Israeli weightlifting team. I'm sorry. In the 72 Olympics. That was an intense time, man. I mean, it's kind of It's kind of a dark joke because most of them got killed, right? But if you look into that, if you look into what happened, yes, there's another conspiracy there, and you can untangle it and pull it apart. And you might be very surprised to find that it could have been another psyop before we even understood or knew what the word psyop was. And if you could go back into the 70s, and I think that there were some real terror networks in the 70s, and there are also AstroTurf terror networks in the 70s. That they were infiltrated and created for the sole purpose of creating a threat. Since we're time traveling in the 70s. So now we have Kim talking to Moon. They're opening up a line of communication. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that I think North Korea is on the ropes in terms of their resources. So what's going to happen if Mr. Kim and Mr. Moon begin to create some bilateral trade agreements together and begin to mend their fences? Oh boy. Now this could be a soft solution to the problem and the threat that the World Bank and the IMF have created in the guise of North Korea as a rogue nation who does not belong to either the IMF or the World Bank. And you know that's their goal, it's to get them in there. So perhaps some form of unification with South Korea and lighting up their relationship with South Korea and the South Koreans' membership of the World Bank solves it all. And all of a sudden they've just turned North Korea, because North Korea now has pretty much a non-sovereign relationship that they're kind of owned, because that's what the World Bank does. It comes in and it owns the resources, essentially, of the countries that are participating in that global fiat banking system that was put in place by the black families of Europe and the Rothschilds, and we know who the players are. They're the ones that control the fiat cash. So that's a way that they could solve it. All of a sudden now they've flipped North Korea without having fired a single shot. But that's not a given. What if North Korea and South Korea begin these bilateral trade agreements and North Korea still has its non-IMF, non-World Bank status? That's problematic. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because they need to flip them. They need to flip them. They need to flip Iran. They need to flip Syria. They need to flip Cuba. I don't think that that's that hard. And then now they need to flip Venezuela as well, who have decided that they're going to do some interesting oil-backed cryptocurrency on their own. Why not? Why not? It's time for some of these governments to get creative and find ways to amortize their resources so they can keep the globalists' hands out of their pockets and maybe actually run a country that is vying for the people. Wouldn't that be a real interesting concept? Without the broad overreach of these the global octopus. So now all of a sudden, Trump wants to talk with North Korea. Okay, we're willing to talk. We're not talking, we're talking. We're not talking, we're talking. We're not talking, we're talking. Welcome to Gemini Land. Now, if North Korea and South Korea are able to strike some kind of a deal, some kind of accord, and North Korea is no longer perceived to be a threat, what do you think Trump is going to do? He's going to take credit for it, just like he took credit for what happened in Syria. I mean, let's be clear about what happened in Syria. The Russians were the ones that basically knocked the shit out of ISIS and sent them back wherever they needed to go to, whether it was Sweden, England, Libya, northern Iraq, wherever they call home. And Trump is claiming credit for it. And of course, his great PR person, Alex Jones, is also, wow, look what he did, look what he did, look what he did to ISIS. And so he didn't do anything. I mean, maybe they exchanged some info. Maybe that's what they did with Russian intelligence at some point. Maybe. I'm being generous here. So if Kim and Moon get together and they shake hands and all of a sudden now they have a new agreement and a new accord, how's that going to affect Trump? Of course he's going to claim credit for it. He's going to say, oh yes, it's through our pressure, everything we did, we changed the situation in North Korea. Well, there could be some truth to that because of all the egregious sanctions that they put on the North Koreans. Heavy-handed, starving people out. Of course, we know that is one of the planks of staging a coup, is that you make people hungry. You make them hungry, and then they get pissed off, and they start pounding their fists, and they start looking at who's in power, and they scream, do something about it. And if they don't do something about it, then of course there are plenty of agents provocateurs already in the environment, locked and loaded, cell phones in hand, small weapons, whatever they need in order to foment unrest and a revolution. Start with the sanctions, make people super hungry, you degrade their quality of life and their lifestyle, and all of a sudden they're much more amenable to regime change. That's it. That's how the program works. So the North Koreans have been, they have been in the crosshairs of this for quite a while. And now it appears that they are, at the very least, having a dialogue. I think this is a good thing. I'm not attributing anything evil towards it. Is Kim going to bring his athletes in? And are they going to be loaded with anthrax and all these other really, virulent strains of bacteria and viruses? I don't know. It's a cynical thought. And I'm sure if you're South Korea, anybody that comes in from North Korea, from the North Korean team, is going to go through a period of quarantine. They're going to test their blood. They're going to test everything before they allow them to enter into the general population. Unless, of course, Moon's in on the conspiracy and will let them in. God, that's a cynical thought, isn't it? But I think that's what they'll wind up doing. And so it's going to be interesting to watch these Olympics, just for the fact that they're going to be held in South Korea. I mean, I've stopped kind of my I didn't see one moment of the Olympics from Brazil. I used to be a huge Olympics guy. And I think the last Olympics I really got into were the ones in Barcelona. And the opening ceremonies in Barcelona were pretty tremendous. Really tremendous. It was like they were they had the Castilian side, and then they had the Barcelonan side. It was very interesting to watch because the Castilian side was very it was tango and all that stuff. And then the other side from Barcelona, or the Barcelonian side, it was like all, they were doing a Goya painting as they're going down the Olympic Boulevard, I'll never forget how they started the Olympic flame. It was very Sagittarian. They had this archer with a flaming arrow, right? And he shot it right through it was the Olympic flame. It was on that arrow. It was like they lit it with the flame, and he shot that thing through the large flame, right? The large candle, and he set that thing on fire. And they were like concerned, like, is this going to work? Is this going to work? And it worked because the gas was coming up through it. And was the flame go out in the air? No, he lit it. It was brilliant. And one of the people who was involved with the staging of the opening ceremonies for the Barcelona Olympics was this guy named Ryuichi Sakamoto, who's a great electronic musician from Japan, and was part of a group called Yellow Magic Orchestra. So that was kind of special. That was the last one I really kind of tuned in on. It was a long time ago. Even though I did go to the Atlanta Olympics, which I've talked about before, and read tarot cards there. That was an interesting experience. So we have Moon, and we have Kim. Moon and Kim and his chi. Kim's getting his chi on. This is an interesting development, and I hope something works out. And I'm going to step outside of my tainted and at times cynical self and promote a scenario where there's some real compromise and two nation states are actually working something out and not succumbing to the pressure of their trade partners or their military allies, or the deep state or the dark deep state that operates underneath and through the supposed normal channels and currents of diplomacy. So let's hope that works out, and let's get this North Korea thing out of the news for a while. Wouldn't that be great? Let's just get it out of the news. Because there are some people who are actually like freaked out by it. There are people who are concerned. Now, here's one concern that I do have. This is the one concern that I do have. Let's say, for instance, Kim and Moon are legit and they're trying to mend this thing. Because remember now, this is a very interesting parallel. The last time Saturn was in Capricorn, what did we have? We had the Reformation of Western Europe, the Soviet Union. All those, the wall fell, and we've talked about this before. Here we go again, Saturn and Capricorn, and we have what? We have this fence that exists between North Korea and South. And Seoul's not that far from that border, that fence border. It's very close. So during Saturn and Capricorn, what happens if that gets resolved? It could happen because the global map was redrawn during the last time Saturn was in Capricorn. And this falls under that rubric. And it's, first decan in Capricorn. So we're talking government and boundaries and rules and laws and all that stuff. And maybe, just maybe, the puppet masters don't want that to happen. They're like, whoa, hold on. We need a threat here. We need an idle threat or not so idle threat. And we don't like the fact that you two guys are actually working this out. That concerns me. That's the part that concerns me. Because they'd be losing a real good puppet, real serviceable puppet. And a puppet that is one that emits fear in people. So what if we could just take that off the table? Well, we could take it off the table right now. Let's just take it off the table right now. Period. End of story. Because we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and if things end, they end, and we go on, and where we go is really dependent upon where our spiritual development is. It's bottom line. So, from our sake, from our perspective, let's just take it off. Period. End of story. But let's say there are people in the world who are really velcroed to this world and the idea of this world and continuity, and there's something to be said for that too. Because if you go too far into the whole spiritual trip, you can become a nihilist. Nothing matters. But what happens if those people don't have to fret and worry and have anxiety about this guy with his button and the missiles that keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the payloads get stronger and stronger and stronger, but we take that off the table? What are those people going to worry about next? Wouldn't it be great if they don't have to worry about Kim? And where does it go from there? Where does North Korea go from there? Do they want another economic and technological power in that part of the world? How does Japan feel? This is very interesting. It's a very, very interesting dynamic. Keep your eye on it, and I think these talks are actually encouraging. I'm going on the encouraging side, even though some people think, it's just Disneyland, whatever. I came across an article today that I thought was worth passing along. And it has to do with the legalization of marijuana. Now, apparently, West Virginia has legalized both hemp and cannabis, which I think is quite smart, considering the fact that they have a massive coal industry there that is on the ropes in a lot of ways. And they need to retrofit their economy. The states at some point need to have the unilateral ability to retrofit their economy. Now, if Jeff Sessions has any say about it, that's not going to happen. But I wanted to share this with you to give you an understanding about the economic impact of what it, and I'm not a pothead. I'm not. I had my experiences with it when I was young. I think there's some incredible medicinal properties to it, which I think are very important and need to be really explored and fleshed out. Could you imagine if they spent a quarter of the budget that they spend on cancer research for cannabis research in finding ways to really maximize the alkaloids and the cannabinoids inside of cannabis as healing components? And wouldn't that be just incredible? What could come out of that? Absolutely. But the other thing too is that we have a prison population, many of which are there on petty drug charges and crimes. And you eliminate those by legalization. Portugal legalized just about everything, and their crime rate went down. Imagine that. And the other thing too is if legalization, when I mean legalization, I'm not talking about commercial production. Legalizing meaning you could grow it. You grow it in your backyard if you wanted to. That's the level of legalization. But of course, this article doesn't take that into account. This article takes into account that there is a legal commercial aspect to the marijuana industry. So, but if you add that to hemp, all of a sudden we have the fuel for a brand new economy. So let me just read this here. This is from Common Dreams. And the author is Rose Taylor. Though a key argument for legalizing marijuana in the United States is that it would put a tremendous necessary dent in the domestic and global failure known as the war on drugs, a new analysis out Wednesday reveals that federal legalization could also raise, this is federal, more than $130 billion in tax revenue by 2025, while also creating more than 1.1 million new jobs. The new study was published by New Frontier Data, a research and marketing firm whose stated mission is to inform cannabis-related policy and business decisions through rigorous, issue-neutral, and comprehensive analysis of the legal cannabis industry. As the Drug Policy Alliance has shown, the criminalization regime and enforcement of keeping marijuana and other drugs illegal costs the U.S. government more than $50 billion annually. That's you. You are the U.S. government. That includes the outrageous cost of imprisoning tens of thousands of people for nonviolent drug offenses. That's right. Meanwhile, according to New Frontier CEO Giada Aguirre de Carcer, boy, that's a real fancy name. I bet you he's one of these guys that wears medallions, like they do in Europe. These guys are always wearing medallions. It's funny. The government would stand to do very well if marijuana, as has been shown in Washington State and Colorado, is taxed as a legal commodity. Absolutely, and that's why the government doesn't like it, because they're not getting the state's money around it. The three most common business taxes that any standard business pays to the federal government are federal business taxes, payroll taxes, and sales taxes. De Carcer explained if cannabis businesses were legalized tomorrow and taxed as normal businesses with a standard 35% tax rate, cannabis businesses would infuse the U.S. economy with an additional $12.6 billion this year. They could, buy a lot more weapons with that money. If you're the military-industrial complex, aren't you turned on by that? Yeah, let's get that money. Let's flip that legal weed switch. As opposed to the current patchwork of states that have legalized either medical marijuana, its recreational use, or both, the analysis looked at what could happen if the U.S. government made it legal to sell marijuana nationwide and included these major findings. If full legalization occurred in all 50 states today, there would be an excess of 782,000 jobs. It would increase to 1.1 million jobs by 2025. Full legalization would result in more legal businesses participating in the markets, more consumers participating in the legal markets, and more employees and office official payrolls, resulting in $4 billion in payroll taxes. By 2025, payroll deductions would increase to $5.9 billion. Assuming a sales tax at the federal level was implemented at 15%, the total tax revenues from 2017 to 2025 would theoretically be $51.7 billion. This amount of revenue would be entirely new revenue to the U.S. Treasury as there are currently no federal sales or excise taxes. By combining the business tax revenues, the payroll withholdings based on the theoretical employment required to support the industry, and the 15% retail sales tax, one can calculate the total federal tax revenue potential of legalization. The combined total is estimated to be $131.8 billion. That's a lot of scratch. It's a lot of lettuce. The difference between the current structure and the theoretical model is a $76.8 billion increase in federal tax revenues. The new data comes in the wake of polling that shows historic levels of support for marijuana legalization nationwide. Of course, people are younger. This is a younger demographic. And the people who are anti-pot and anti-legalization at some point, like Jeff Sessions, although Jeff Sessions might live to be 200 with all of that Capricorn in his chart, they're going to eventually get phased out. And you're going to have a bunch of young people or younger people making decisions. Now, it remains to be seen how the Pluto and Sagittarius kids are going to vote along these lines, or be along. They're just coming into the marketplace now. They're about 22 years old. So when we talk millennials now, the millennial label is going to shift a little bit. And it's not going to be the same. The first wave that's coming in from Pluto and Sag also have Neptune and Uranus in Aquarius. So they're going to be a little bit more radical in some ways. Different, really free-spirited, and extremely bright. But I would say probably, let's see, what are we now? 22 years old, roughly. The first wave came in right around 1996, so about 22. When you get the 26-year-olds, 27-year-olds coming in, or let's say, well, hold on a second, that's going to be them. So 5 years from now, so it'll be the next group of 22-year-olds about 5 years from now. They'll be different because Uranus and Neptune, I believe, was still in Aquarius, but Uranus moved into Pisces. Uranus moved into Pisces. So it's a bit of a different, and then eventually that's kind of how it stays for a while. Pretty much how it stays until Pluto goes into Capricorn. Because my son was born, he's a Pluto Sag kid, and he's born with Uranus and Pisces and Neptune and Aquarius. Very unusual. The planets flip. Anyway, we're going to have a different discussion about millennials here starting in the next couple of years, because that first wave with Pluto and Sag is, Pluto and Scorpio, they're moving up the ladder now, and I believe there are less of the Pluto and Sag kids than there are the Pluto and Scorpio kids. I could be mistaken, but I believe there's less. The new data comes in the wake of polling that shows historic levels of support. In October of 2017, a Gallup survey found that 64% of Americans now favor legal marijuana, the highest level ever recorded. It's also an issue that receives backing from people across the political spectrum. According to the Gallup poll, a majority of Republicans, 51%, are in favor, while independents, 67%, and Democrats, 72%, support legalization at even higher levels. Okay, you throw in cannabis along with that, and to me, the cannabis industry is the sleeping giant. I've been talking about cannabis since 2011, and really had a lot of kind of hardcore discussions about it. 2012, 2013, I had the late John Trudell on a couple times, who's part of the Hempstead Heart Project, and we got into it pretty intensely. That is the sleeping giant, and keep your eye on West Virginia, who apparently have legalized both. And that's a part of the country that is tragically connected to opioids and opioid addiction. And wouldn't it be great if they could get those people off opioids on something much more manageable, and actually give them jobs that could pay for things other than their weekly subscription to fentanyl and their local CVS dealer. That's it. That's the wave of the future. If we're going to stand for something, that'd be something to really stand for. And that stands in opposition to AI. I almost think that AI and cannabis and hemp are these two, sort of elephants in the room. And when we talk about cannabis and hemp, and especially on the cannabis, on the hemp side, this is an analog product. This is coming out of the earth. And I'm sure there's some applications that they could use with hemp on an industrial side, and maybe they already have, to augment their AI machinery. I mean, there could be real crossover. I'm not saying that the two are mutually exclusive, but they tend to be, from their genesis, one starts in a synthetic realm and the other starts in an analog realm. And so the businesses and the opportunities that could come out of hemp are tremendous, and they anchor our analog and organic and our relationship to the earth in a way that could be really prosperous. Now, of course, it'll piss a lot of other industries off. The timber industry won't like it because hemp paper is way cheaper. The oil industry may not like it because of all the petroleum byproducts that hemp could step in for and be used as solvents and all the other things in a much more healthy and biodegradable fashion. So if we're going to fight for something, and if you're a millennial and you're listening to this, and I do have millennials that listen to the show, if you're a millennial and you're listening to this, here's where you can build a bridge with the baby boomers. Because the baby boomers come out of, and I know that there are some really powerful silver activists who were born in the 1940s and the 50s, early 50s. And these are people that are really dedicated to bringing things like hemp and legalization. And if I had to, prioritize it, for me, hemp would be 1A, and then legalization below that. And I'm all for the medical application. Recreation, look, if we're talking about cannabis from 1970, I'm standing up and I'm lighting up. Okay. But things have changed with the sativas, and they've gotten way more potent. And there's a lot of talk about genetic modification and all the stuff that's gone on that we actually rail against with other products, with other genuses, whether it's tomatoes or salmon, right? So that there's been talk about that in the cannabis and the sativa community, and who knows what we're smoking. So that's my one concern about the legalization process. If you grow it yourself and you have heirloom seeds, which apparently are very hard to find, then you get to circumnavigate everything, right? And you get the best of both worlds. But if you're a millennial and you're listening to this, go out and find some of these silver activists who are, putting their flag in the ground for, this legalization process. Join forces. And get involved. Saturn's on your Neptune. Get involved. Make it happen. All right. I think not a lot of vitriol today. Not a lot of vitriol. I'm gonna take my vitriol pills tomorrow morning, and I'll get into some more vitriol tomorrow. No, I can't plan that stuff. I can't plan it. I get up. I'm in a space. I'm in a state, and then we go. I pick a few things, and we go. All right, why don't we wrap it right there? As always, thank you for tuning in and listening in. It's always a pleasure to get comments over on YouTube and sometimes even in Spreaker. And I'll be back 24 hours from today. What's today? Today's Thursday, right? No, tomorrow I'll do the Friday Forecast. A little more than 24 hours, about 27 hours from today. Noon Central Standard Time. And that's about it. That's about it. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open to what's possible. Have a fantastic day. I'm Robert Phoenix. Take good care, and I'll see everybody tomorrow.